All right, hello everybody. I am going to see if I can fit the rest of our slides into a single video, starting at slide 18. So last time we were talking about the fundamental attribution error, and we're going to continue on that front for a few more slides. I had some questions for you guys in slide 17 that I have posted in the discussion board for you to think about. But one of the questions that all leads to is whether the fundamental attribution error, come here baby cat, is something that's actually universal or not. And something we have found from different studies across various cultures is that it seems to be more prevalent in individualistic societies than in collectivist cultures. So we seem to be much more likely to blame people's personalities or the group membership that they're in for their actions if we are in an individualistic culture. So that's something to think about as we move forward. So as we go to slide 19, you know, the textbook touched on how the fundamental attribution error is really something that came into play heavily in World War II and the Holocaust. And why, you know, this is something that we have to take so incredibly seriously. And so for any of you who have studied Holocaust history, you know that one of the primary factors for why selective groups were targeted for mass extermination, whether they were Jewish, Roma, the disabled, communists, LGBTQ people, clergy, etc., was because of specified group membership and the perceptions that were identified around those group members. So it was the fundamental attribution error applied to the people in those groups, and it had horrific consequences, often based in false science. So we found a lot of not just white superiority during World War II, and also other events like slavery within America and a lot of the Western world. And, you know, following with Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. But we find that, you know, a lot of junk science was used to try to buffer up these eugenics laws and racial segregation laws. Unfortunately, Missouri is the home of eugenics. In fact, Kirksville, Missouri, up near the Iowa border, was the home of where this science came out of in the late 1800s. The research that came out of Missouri influenced, you know, the German Nazi Party and why it went about using, you know, skull measurements and facial features as these physical attributes to try to explain race science. So there were a lot of, you know, really awful genocidal consequences of using bad science in relation to the fundamental attribution error, whether that was, you know, using phrenology and craniology with the measuring of the skull to assume that people had different brain sizes based on race, whether that was to assume that there were gender differences between men and women based off of, you know, skull size, saying that men had larger brains than women and thus were more intelligent. And this caused a lot of false beliefs. Unfortunately, though the science has been completely disproven in the past 70 years, a lot of these beliefs persist. And it's really part of our duty as psychologists to right these wrongs because they did start in our field. And it's one of the reasons why we have to teach this and we have to push ethics so strongly within the field of psychology. So if we look at slide 20, we see a little bit of the more modern science on human variation, and basically why the idea of race science is just so incredibly false. So if we look at the Human Genome Project, it shows that the most genetic variation in human beings is just within a single population. So, 85 to 90% of variation between humans, you're just going to find in one little population. It's not between populations, and between, individuals themselves. Or rather, it's in between individuals within that population. So basically, each individual, the differences that we have between each other is very minute. Even differences between what we would consider a racial group is 10 to 15% of the difference, and the rest is individual difference within that group. So, there's much larger variation in that single group than between the different groups. So something to kind of think about. I might write up more in the discussion board on this topic because it's very nuanced and a little bit difficult to parse out. But kind of it comes down to the fact that biologists, when they're looking at species, for instance, which is what early scientists over 100 years ago were trying to make out races between humans as being, there needs to be a 25 to 30% variance between each species, which they're considering each race. And there just isn't that much variance between any of the races for humans. It's just a very small amount of difference. However, if you look on slide 21, to kind of use a metaphor for this, if you look at different types of dog breeds, that is more what we're talking about for different species. Different breeds are more similar to racial groups in a biological sense. Humans have nothing like this. If you look at slide 21, for examples, we don't have that type of diversity in the human genome. And so that's why it's saying that we don't have the capacity for races differentiating us. There's far too much overlap in humans for there to be races. Baby cat, you can't dig there. She's trying to dig out the other cat who's under the blankets. You can't dig there. The other cat can't come out. He's sleeping. Anyway, on slide 22, just kind of reiterating that the fundamental attribution error is a profound error. Especially, it's a profound error of seeing the other person as biologically distinct from us. And it's, one of the roots of a lot of human misery. And societies are often structured around racial categories that end up leading to traumas, poverty, and many other negative outcomes. Think of, for instance, the outcome of school segregation, which is still a major problem. Even here in St. Louis, we have one of the most racially segregated school systems in the country. And I have, a picture there of the cranium, just to show, cranial measurements were used for decades to try to show differences between people. Okay, she's still trying to dig out the other cat. And, you know, it was completely subjective from doctor to doctor doing these measurements. There were tons of counterexamples that were completely ignored. The data was often manipulated. And then also it would have meant that every single male brain was larger. And so they tried to use that to say that every single male was smarter. And we know that that's not always the case.